On the Tragedies of Shakespeare by Charles Lamb, considered with reference to their fitness for stage representation. Taking a turn the other day in the Abbey, I was struck with the affected attitude of a figure, which I do not remember to have seen before, and which upon examination proved to be a whole length of the celebrated Mr. Garrick. Though I would not go so far with some good Catholics abroad as to shut players altogether out of consecrated ground, yet I own I was not a little scandalized at the introduction of theatrical airs and gestures into a place set apart to remind us of the saddest realities. Going nearer, I found inscribed under his harlequin figure the following lines: "To paint fair nature by divine command, her magic pencil in his glowing hand. As Shakespeare rose, then to expand his fame, wide o'er this breathing world a Garrick came. Though sunk in death the forms the poet drew, the actor's genius made them breathe anew. Though like the bard himself in night they lay, immortal Garrick called them back to day. Until eternity with power sublime shall mark the mortal hour of hoary time, Shakespeare and Garrick like twin stars shall shine, and earth irradiate with a beam divine." It would be an insult to my readers' understandings to attempt anything like a criticism on this farrago of false thoughts and nonsense, but the reflection it led me into was a kind of wonder how from the days of the actor here celebrated to our own, it should have been the fashion to compliment every performer in his turn that has the luck to please the town in any of the great characters of Shakespeare, with a notion of possessing a mind congenial to the poets. How people should come thus unaccountably to confound the power of originating poetical images and conceptions with the faculty of being able to read or recite the same when put into words. It is observable that we fall into this confusion only in dramatic recitations. We never dream that the gentleman who reads Lucretius in public with great applause is therefore a great poet and philosopher, nor do we find that Tom Davies, the bookseller, who was recorded to have recited the Paradise Lost better than any man in England in his day, though I cannot help thinking there must be some mistake in this tradition, was therefore by his intimate friends set upon a level with Milton. Or what connection that absolute mastery over the heart and soul of man, which a great dramatic poet possesses, has with those low tricks upon the eye and ear, which a player, by observing a few general effects which some common passion as grief, anger, etc., usually has upon the gestures and exterior, can easily compass. To know the internal workings and movements of a great mind, of an Othello or a Hamlet, for instance, the when and the why and the how far they should be removed. To what pitch a passion is becoming, to give the reins and to pull in the curb exactly at the moment when the drawing in or the slacking is most graceful, seems to demand a reach of intellect of a vastly different extent from that which is employed upon the bare imitation of the signs of these passions in the countenance or gesture, which signs are usually observed to be most lively and emphatic in the weaker sort of minds, and which signs can after all but indicate some passion, as I said before, anger or grief generally, but of the motives and grounds of the passion wherein it differs from the same passion in low and vulgar natures, of these the actor can give no more idea by his face or gesture than the eye, without a metaphor, can speak, or the muscles utter intelligible sounds. But such is the instantaneous nature of the impressions which we take in at the eye and ear at a playhouse, compared with the slow apprehension oftentimes of the understanding in reading, that we are apt not only to sink the playwriter in the consideration which we pay to the actor, but even to identify in our minds in a perverse manner the actor with the character which he represents. It is difficult for a frequent playgoer to disembarrass the idea of Hamlet from the person and voice of Mr. K. We speak of Lady Macbeth while we are in reality thinking of Mrs. S. Nor is this confusion incidental alone to unlettered persons who, not possessing the advantage of reading, are necessarily dependent upon the stage player for all the pleasure which they can receive from the drama, and to whom the very idea of What an author is cannot be made comprehensible without some pain and perplexity of mind. The error is one from which persons otherwise not meanly lettered find it almost impossible to extricate themselves. Never let me be so ungrateful as to forget the very high degree of satisfaction which I received some years back from seeing for the first time a tragedy of Shakespeare performed, in which these two great performers sustained the principal parts. It seemed to embody and realize conceptions which had hitherto assumed no distinct shape. But dearly do we pay all our life afterwards for this juvenile pleasure, this sense of distinctness. When the novelty is past, we find to our cost that instead of realizing an idea, we have only materialized and brought down a fine vision to the standard of flesh and blood. We have let go a dream in quest of an unattainable substance. How cruelly this operates upon the mind to have its free conceptions thus cramped and pressed down to the measure of a straight-lacing actuality may be judged from that delightful sensation of freshness with which we turn to those plays of Shakespeare which have escaped being performed, and to those passages in the acting plays of the same writer which have happily been left out of the performance. How far the very custom of hearing anything spouted withers and blows upon a fine passage may be seen in those speeches from Henry V, etc., which are current in the mouths of schoolboys from their being to found, which are current in the mouths of schoolboys from their being to be found in Enfield speakers, and such kind of books. I confess myself utterly unable to appreciate that celebrated soliloquy in Hamlet, beginning to be or not to be, or to tell whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. It has been so handled and pawed about by declamatory boys and men, and torn so inhumanly from its living place and principle of continuity in the play, till it has become to me a perfect dead member. It may seem a paradox, but I cannot help being of opinion that the plays of Shakespeare are less calculated for performance on a stage than those of almost any other dramatist whatever. Their distinguished excellence is a reason that they should be so. There is so much in them which comes not under the province of acting, with which eye and tone and gesture have nothing to do. I'm going to reread that, of course. It may seem a paradox, but I cannot help being of opinion that the plays of Shakespeare are less calculated for performance on a stage than those of almost any other dramatist whatever. Their distinguished excellence is a reason that they should be so. There is so much in them which comes not under the province of acting, with which eye and tone and gesture have nothing to do. The glory of the scenic art is to personate passion and the turns of passion, and the more coarse and palpable the passion is, the more hold upon the eyes and ears of the spectators the performer obviously possesses. For this reason, scolding scenes where two persons talk themselves into a fit of fury, and then in a surprising manner talk themselves out of it again, have always been the most popular upon our stage. And the reason is plain, because the spectators are here most palpably appealed to. They are the proper judges in this war of words. They are the legitimate ring that should be formed round such intellectual prize fighters. Talking is the direct object of the imitation here. But in the best dramas, and in Shakespeare above all, how obvious it is that the form of speaking, whether it be in soliloquy or dialogue, is only a medium and often a highly artificial one, for putting the reader or spectator into possession of that knowledge of the inner structure and workings of mind in a character which he could otherwise never have arrived at in that form of composition by any gift short of intuition. We do here as we do with novels written in the epistolary form. How many improprieties, perfect solecisms in letter writing do we put up with in Clarissa and other books for the sake of the delight which that form upon the whole gives us? But the practice of stage representation reduces everything to a controversy of elocution. Every character, from the boisterous blaspheming of Bajazet to the shrinking timidity of womanhood, must play the orator. The love dialogues of Romeo and Juliet, those silver-sweet sounds of lovers' tongues by night, the more intimate and sacred sweetness of nuptial colloquy between an Othello or a Posthumus with their married wives, all those delicacies which are so delightful in the reading, as when we read of those youthful dalliances in paradise, as beseemed fair couple linked in happy nuptial league, alone. By the inherent fault of stage representation, how are these things sullied and turned from their very nature by being exposed to a large assembly? When such speeches as Imogen addresses to her lord come drawling out of the mouth of a hired actress, whose courtship, though nominally addressed to the personated Posthumus, is manifestly aimed at the spectators, who are to judge of her endearments and her returns of love. The character of Hamlet is perhaps that by which, since the days of Betterton, a succession of popular performers have had the greatest ambition to distinguish themselves. The length of the part may be one of their reasons, but for the character itself, we find it in a play, and therefore we judge it a fit subject of dramatic representation. The play itself abounds in maxims and reflections beyond any other, and therefore we consider it as a proper vehicle for conveying moral instruction. But Hamlet himself, what does he suffer meanwhile by being dragged forth as a public schoolmaster to give lectures to the crowd? Why, 9 parts in 10 of what Hamlet does are transactions between himself and his moral sense. They are the effusions of his solitary musings, which he retires to holes and corners in the most sequestered parts of the palace to pour forth. Or rather, they are the silent meditations with which his bosom is bursting, reduced to words for the sake of the reader, who must else remain ignorant of what is passing there. These profound sorrows, these light and noise abhorring ruminations, which the tongue scarce dares utter to deaf walls and chambers, how can they be represented by a gesticulating actor who comes and mouths them out before an audience, making 400 people his confidants at once? I say not that it is the fault of the actor so to do. He must pronounce them or rotundo. He must accompany them with his eye. He must insinuate them into his auditory by some trick of eye. He must insinuate them into his auditory by some trick of eye, tone, or gesture, or he fails. He must be thinking all the while of his appearance because he knows that all the while the spectators are judging of it. And this is the way to represent the shy, negligent, retiring Hamlet. It is true that there is no other mode of conveying a vast quantity of thought and feeling to a great portion of the audience who otherwise would never learn it for themselves by reading, and the intellectual acquisition gained this way may, for aught I know, be inestimable. But I'm not arguing that Hamlet should not be acted, but how much Hamlet is made another thing by being acted. I have heard much of the wonders which Garrick performed in this part, but as I never saw him, I must have leave to doubt whether the representation of such a character came within the province of his art. Those who tell me of him speak of his eye, of the magic of his eye, and of his commanding voice, physical properties, vastly desirable in an actor and without which he can never insinuate meaning into an auditory. But what have they to do with Hamlet? What have they to do with intellect? In fact, the things aimed at in theatrical representation are to arrest the spectator's eye upon the form and the gesture, and to gain a more favorable hearing to what is spoken. It is not what the character is, but how he looks. Not what he says, but how he speaks it. I see no reason to think that if the play of Hamlet were written over again by some such writer as Banks or Lillo, retaining the process of the story, but totally omitting all the poetry of it, all the divine features of Shakespeare, his stupendous intellect, and only taking care to give us enough of passionate dialogue, which Banks or Lillo were never at a loss to furnish, I see not how the effect could be much different upon an audience, nor how the actor has it in his power to represent Shakespeare to us differently from his representation of Banks or Lillo. Hamlet would still be a youthful, accomplished prince, and must be gracefully personated. He might be puzzled in his mind, wavering in his conduct, seemingly cruel to Ophelia. He might see a ghost and start at it, and address it kindly when he found it to be his father. All this in the poorest and most homely language of the servilest creeper after nature that ever consulted the palate of an audience, without troubling Shakespeare for the matter, and I see not but there would be room for all the power which an actor has to display himself. All the passions and changes of passion might remain, for those are much less difficult to write or act than is thought. It is a trick easy to be attained. It is but rising or falling a note or two in the voice, a whisper with a significant foreboding look to announce its approach, and so contagious the counterfeit appearance of any emotion is, that let the words be what they will, the look and tone shall carry it off and make it pass for deep skill in the passions. It is common for people to talk of Shakespeare's plays being so natural that everybody can understand him. They are natural indeed. They are grounded deep in nature, so deep that the depth of them lies out of the reach of most of us. You shall hear the same person say that George Barnwell is very natural and Othello is very natural, that they are both very deep, and to them they are the same kind of thing. At the one they sit and shed tears because a good sort of young man is tempted by a naughty woman to commit a trifling peccadillo, the murder of an uncle or so. If this note could hope to meet the eye of any of the managers, I would entreat and beg of them in the name of both the galleries that this insult upon the morality of the common people of London should cease to be eternally repeated in the holiday weeks. Why are the prentices of this famous and well-governed city, instead of an amusement, to be treated over and over again with a nauseous sermon of George Barnwell? Why, at the end of their vistas, are we to place the gallows? Were I an uncle, I should not much like a nephew of mine to have such an example placed before his eyes. It is really making uncle murder too trivial to exhibit it as done upon such slight motives. It is attributing too much to such characters as Millwood. It is putting things into the heads of good young men which they would never otherwise have dreamed of. Uncles that think anything of their lives should fairly petition the Chamberlain against it. That is all, and so comes to an untimely end, which is so moving. And at the other, because a blackamoor in a fit of jealousy kills his innocent white wife, and the odds that are that 99 out of 100 would willingly behold the same catastrophe happen to both the heroes, and have thought the rope more due to Othello than to Barnwell. For of the texture of Othello's mind, the inward construction marvelously laid open with all its strengths and weaknesses, its heroic confidences and its human misgivings, its agonies of hate springing from the depths of love. They see no more than the spectators at a cheaper rate, who pay their pennies apiece to look through the man's telescope in Leicester Fields, see into the inward plot and topography of the moon. Some dim thing or other they see an actor personating a passion of grief, of anger, for instance, and they recognize it as a copy of the usual external effects of such passions, or at least as being true to that symbol of the emotion which passes current at the theater for it. For it is often no more than that, but of the grounds of the passionate's correspondence to a great or heroic nature, which is the only worthy object of tragedy, that common auditors know anything of this, or can have any such notions denned into them by the mere strength of an actor's lungs, that apprehensions foreign to them should be thus infused into them by storm, I can neither believe nor understand how it can be possible. We talk of Shakespeare's admirable observation of life when we should feel that not from a petty inquisition into those cheap and everyday characters which surrounded him as they surround us, but from his own mind, which was, to borrow a phrase of Ben Jonson's, the very, quote, sphere of humanity, end of quote, he fetched those images of virtue and of knowledge, of which every one of us, recognizing a part, think we comprehend in our natures the whole, and oftentimes mistake the powers which he positively creates in us for nothing more than indigenous faculties of our own minds, which only waited the application of corresponding virtues in him to return a full and clear echo of the same. I'm going to repeat that one because it got by me. We talk of Shakespeare's admirable observation of life when we should feel that not from a petty inquisition into those cheap and everyday characters which surrounded him as they surround us, but from his own mind, which was, to borrow a phrase of Ben Jonson's, the very, quote, sphere of humanity, end of quote. He fetched those images of virtue and of knowledge, of which every one of us, recognizing a part, think we comprehend in our natures the whole, and oftentimes mistake the powers which he positively creates in us for nothing more than indigenous faculties of our own minds, which only waited the application of corresponding virtues in him to return a full and clear echo of the same. To return to Hamlet, among the distinguishing features of that wonderful character, one of the most interesting yet painful is that soreness of mind which makes him treat the intrusions of Polonius with harshness, and that asperity which he puts on in his interviews with Ophelia. These tokens of an unhinged mind, if they be not mixed in the latter case with a profound artifice of love, to alienate Ophelia by affected discourtesies, so to prepare her mind for the breaking off of that loving intercourse, which can no longer find a place amidst business so serious as that which he has to do, are parts of his character, which, to reconcile with our admiration of Hamlet, the most patient consideration of his situation is no more than necessary. They are what we forgive afterwards and explain by the whole of his character. But at the same time, they are harsh and unpleasant. Yet such is the actor's necessity of giving strong blows to the audience. That I have never seen a player in this character who did not exaggerate and strain to the utmost these ambiguous features, these temporary deformities in the character. They make him express a vulgar scorn at Polonius which utterly degrades his gentility, and which no explanation can render palatable. They make him show contempt and curl up the nose at Ophelia's father, contempt in its very grossest and most hateful form. But they get applause by it. It is natural, people say. That is, the words are scornful and the actor expresses scorn, and that they can judge of. But why so much scorn, and of that sort they never think of asking? So to Ophelia, all the Hamlets that I've ever seen rant and rave at her, as if she had committed some great crime, and the audience are highly pleased because the words of the part are satirical and they are enforced by the strongest expression of satirical indignation of which the face and voice are capable. But then whether Hamlet is likely to have put on such brutal appearances to a lady whom he loved so dearly is never thought on. The truth is that in all such deep affections as had subsisted between Hamlet and Ophelia, there is a stock of supererogatory love, if I may venture to use the expression, which in any great grief of heart, especially where that which preys upon the mind cannot be communicated, confers a kind of indulgence upon the grieved party to express itself, even to its heart's dearest object, in the language of a temporary alienation. But it is not alienation, it is a distraction purely, and so it always makes itself to be felt by that object. It is not anger, but grief assuming the appearance of anger, love awkwardly counterfeiting as hate, as sweet countenances when they try to frown. But such sternness and fierce disgust as Hamlet is made to show is no counterfeit, but the real face of absolute aversion, of irreconcilable alienation. It may be said he puts on the madman, but then he should only so far put on this counterfeit lunacy as his own real distraction will give him leave, that is, incompletely, imperfectly, not in that confirmed, practiced way, like a master of his art, or as Dane quickly would say, quote, like one of those harlotry players, end of quote. I mean no disrespect to any actor, but the sort of pleasure which Shakespeare's plays give in the acting seems to me not at all to differ from that which the audience receive from those of other writers, and they being in themselves essentially so different from all others, I must conclude that there is something in the nature of acting which levels all distinctions, and in fact, who does not speak indifferently of The Gamester and of Macbeth as fine stage performances, and praise the Mrs. Beverley in the same way as the Lady Macbeth of Mrs. S. Belvidera and Callista and Isabella and Euphrasia, are they less liked than Imogen, or than Juliet, or than Desdemona? Are they not spoken of and remembered in the same way? Is not the female performer as great, as they call it, in one as in the other? Did not Garrick shine, and was he not